Hey folks, Randy Newberg here with another episode of Leopold's Hunt Talk Radio. This one is a little bit different. I'm doing the introduction before we sign on here together. Actually, we're not signing on together. Today I'm doing a live podcast from Portland, Oregon. My guest is Brian Wolfer. He's the Deputy Wildlife Division Administrator for what they call ODFW, which is Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we put a big, request for questions and comments out on our social media platforms, and man, did we get a lot of them, which is great. We kind of categorized them into certain, categories. And a lot of them are about predators. A big bunch of it is about how, why, and what the benefits are of Oregon redoing their mule deer plan and their mule deer units and how they're going to do a bunch of stuff. I'm going to throw a bunch of things in here about I guess you'll call it the separation of duties or responsibilities of how kind of the hierarchy of wildlife agencies. They usually work under a commission and a director. And then the commission and the director are usually governor appointees, subject to Senate confirmation or legislative confirmation somewhere. So you have things that are implemented by commissions, which can't go outside the sideboards of the legislature, which can't go outside or usually doesn't go outside the boundaries of any ballot initiatives, which usually can't go outside the sideboards of federal law. So in Oregon, a lot of the questions came about things related to wolves. And Brian and I know, are going to get into this, but the wolves in 2/3 of Oregon are governed by the Endangered Species Act, which is a federal law. A lot of stuff was asked about mountain lions. Well, there's a ballot initiative that passed in the 90s that limits what ODFW can do about mountain lions. So with all these things, I got to talk to Brian before this podcast to cover a lot of these things, and he's got a pretty good view of how the department has tried their best to give hunters as much opportunity as possible within all these sideboards. So I think this is going to be a really interesting one. Brian is not able, as a government employee, he's not able to weigh in on legislative issues, ballot initiatives, nothing like that. So if you hear any comments about something that sounds like a political issue, those are from me. Brian has nothing to do with those. Anytime I have a state or federal employee on the podcast, I got to make sure that the audience understands. They are not here advocating. By law, they cannot advocate. They can provide information. And right now, this November, some of you may know, and we're going to be doing a whole nother podcast series on this, is there's a ballot initiative. I think it's called IP28 or something like that. It just needs a few thousand more signatures. It'll be on the ballot in November. And it would make a lot of things illegal in Oregon: hunting, fishing, ranching, farming, all kinds of stuff. So we'll save that for a different day. A lot of you ask questions about that, but since it hasn't got the number of signatures yet, and I don't want to put Brian in a hard spot, we're not going to ask the questions about that. We're saving that for a different time. But anyhow, this will be in front of a live audience, and I hope that the way we've categorized these questions makes sense. Hope it gives you a bunch of good advice and information. And those of you who don't live in Oregon might look at this as kind of a what could be coming to your state someday through ballot initiatives, through legislation, through whatever. And so I hope it gives you, those of you not living in Oregon, a good feel for how they've had to navigate a lot of things that they don't have a lot of control over. So anyhow, with that, I'm going to quit talking And in a few minutes, Brian and I are going to fire up the microphones here in front of a crowd. So appreciate y'all being here. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks for listening.
This is weird because I'm trying to speak to the recorded audience and I'm trying to speak to the live audience here. And the live audience knows if we flub something up because they're going to be like, they cut that part out. That didn't work. But Brian, thanks for being here. Brian Wolfer, you are the Assistant Deputy Wildlife.
Yeah, so it's great to be here. Yeah. Nice to have you out here in Oregon at the sports show. I'm the Wildlife Division Deputy Administrator. So in some states they call like the head of wildlife the chief, and I'd be the deputy to that here in Oregon.
You're the person that gets work done then. I don't want you to get in trouble with your boss. We're trying to lighten things up a little bit here. Last year I had your boss, Director Cougar, on this podcast. Yes. And I saw her yesterday, and she's like, "Oh, I read all those comments. You tell Brian nothing's off limits." Wait, there are 2 ODFW employees in the back who told you were there when she told me that, right? They're pleading. They're gonna blame it all on you, Brian. But anyhow, for folks listening, we are at the Pacific Northwest Sports Show here in Portland, which is a great show every February. And there's so many cool things going on here. If you really want a flavor for the diversity of hunting and fishing in Oregon, you come to this show, and it kind of is sensory overload of how much you guys have. And last year, as I said, we had Director Colbert. I do a live podcast where we took questions on our social media platforms. And today, Brian, it is you. So, for my audience that isn't here and that is listening, what's the 2-minute, here's my background, here's what I do?
My 2-minute background? So I've been with the department for about 28 years now. Started at the kind of bottom rungs of the agency and worked my way through some different field positions. Spent some time working in Eastern Oregon as well as Western Oregon. Spent about a dozen years as a district wildlife biologist, managing the wildlife populations in the south end of the Willamette Valley. And then moved into our wildlife division, where I was our game program manager for a while, overseeing our game program coordinators. So ungulates, fur bears, carnivores, upland birds, waterfowl, and the staff that are really doing the work with those. And then now for the last couple of years, I've been the deputy in our wildlife division.
Okay. Wow. You're not a trained accountant like I am then.
I'm not a trained accountant, but there's some accounting, and fortunately we've got some very good budget and accounting folks within the division that can help keep me straight that way.
All right. Well, good. Everyone says it's so easy to tell you're an accountant, Randy. And I don't know how to take that, and someone walks up to you and says, "Hey, you must be an accountant." I don't know, is that a compliment or is that like making fun of me? But anyhow, with this, we put out questions on our Facebook page. I say we. My crew did, because I don't know how to use social media. So my phone is right here, and it has an icon on it that is an Instagram icon. And when I click on it, a bunch of red dots show up in the upper left. I have no idea what those mean. And people will get a hold of me like, "Hey, can you post this on Instagram?" I'm like, "Here's Michael's number. Call him." I have no idea. So anyhow, the fact that anything got put on our platforms of Instagram and Facebook, I take no credit for. But we told people you were going to be here. And we asked questions, and we got a lot of questions. So we went through and we tried to kind of categorize them into certain topics. And as you might have guessed the idea that you guys are going to change or have a new mule deer plan, we're definitely going to have to cover that one.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of questions about that. I did a seminar yesterday, and a couple of the questions were, well, can you tell me what unit I should apply for under the new mule deer plan in Oregon? I'm like, you need to come to the live podcast tomorrow, because Brian will tell you where to apply.
The live podcast or our booth, and we've got folks in the booth downstairs helping people with that right now.
Yeah. So a lot of things that were in there are predator management.
Yep.
I mean, there were a lot of questions about that. And I always try to explain to people that where I live in Montana, we had a congressional action that delisted wolves in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming for the most part. I always say those three. You guys haven't necessarily had the benefit of that, especially in the western 2/3 of Oregon. In Montana, we don't have a ballot initiative that changed how we can hunt mountain lions. Like you guys have had all kinds of things. So when we start talking about these things about use of dogs or bait or whatever, anything that it relates to wolves, mountain lions, bears, what's the background here in Oregon that as a guy from Montana who's like, why is this such a big deal here? You guys have a lot more sideboards than I have to deal with.
Yeah, we probably do. And I don't know everything about Montana. I've got enough to keep track of here in Oregon. But management of those species has kind of a long history through Oregon. And what some people don't realize is that when you look back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, clear up into like 1960s, you had some very limited protections or no protections on some of that. So cougars were unprotected. There was a bounty on those for a while. I think that bounty even got as high as $50, which when you're talking about the 1930s and 40s, that's a lot of money.
That's a week's pay or more.
Species like bear, you had some regulations on take of bear in parts of the state before the 1960s, but much of the state, those were also treated as kind of an unprotected species. And populations, especially on cougars, got very, very low. And so the estimate is that by the mid-1960s, we only had about 200 cougars left in the state. They were close to being extirpated. And so the legislature classified cougar as a game species and did that so that we could maintain that species within the state. So that was a legislative move that happened. I guess what I'd say is, like at that point in time, if we had the Endangered Species Act in Oregon, like they were low enough that they probably would have been listed as an endangered species. But under Department of Fish and Wildlife Management, seasons were closed for a couple of years, and then some limited hunting was allowed and controlled hunts in areas where there was conflict. And then over time, as that cougar population began to recover and increase, then hunting was allowed in some more areas, again, controlled. And so by the time we hit the early 1990s, we had about 3,000 cougars in the state. Hunting was all lottery draw. I think tags were pretty expensive for early 1990s, like around $50.
Wow.
And success rate was quite high on those seasons. So we were managing those populations to try to address damage and conflict while also making sure that we had recovered populations. And then in 1994, there was a ballot initiative. It was Measure 18. And Measure 18 banned the use of dogs for hunting bears and cougars and banned the use of bait for bears. And so at that point, people that drew a cougar tag had to draw it in the lottery. There were limited numbers of those. They paid $50 for them. And harvest really dropped off. And so a cougar population that was already increasing started to increase at a faster rate over the next few years, while we worked with the legislature and our commission to change some of the cougar regulations. And so over the next really decade, or a little more than a decade, we went from controlled hunts to general season tags. went from having hunts that lasted for a couple of months to eventually having a year-round cougar season, January 1 through the end of December. The legislature lowered the price of cougar tags, and so those dropped down to, like at that time, it might have been $11 or $12 or so. I think now it's around $16.50, and that's both resident and non-resident. So a bear and cougar tag in this state are quite cheap, but success rate is very, very low. Yeah. And so we've seen that cougar population continue to expand in Oregon, likely in many places, probably starting to come close to carrying capacity. We're right around 7,000 cougars in the state right now. Still maintaining that year-round season. We have the opportunity for people to buy 2 tags if they choose to buy 2 tags, and we're trying to maximize that hunting opportunity there. But really, through the hunting seasons that we can run, we don't have much ability to hold those populations. Like, we couldn't pick a target and say we want to have 5,000 cougars and expect to really be able to get there, but have likely been able to take some of those spikes out. As you know, with wildlife populations that are on an increase, you oftentimes overshoot carrying capacity, and then they crash down below it, and you get that cycle. We're probably not going to go through that like we would have if we didn't have hunting and hunters to help us manage populations, but we're also not really able to hold those down.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you're within the confines of a ballot initiative, you're trying to use as many tools as you have in your box.
Yes, and we've got some additional tools. Maybe I'll take like the first left turn here, and since we're talking about ballot initiatives,
we love going in the ditch, Brian. So let's not stay on the rails too much.
So I might run you in the ditch, but when you talk about ballot initiatives, I imagine every state's probably a little unique, but most of them are probably similar. Here in Oregon, there's a state law that says, hey, state agencies, employees in their official capacity can't take a position on ballot initiatives, recalls, candidates, and those sorts of things. And so when we have a ballot initiative, and one of the kind of frustrating complaints that we saw out of Measure 18 was, like, where was the department? We expected them to be advocating for hunters. That's not our role in those situations. And so we get to provide some facts, like here's how many cougars are currently being harvested. Here's how much a cougar tag costs. And maybe if we can tell what that outcome might be, like here's how we would implement this new law. But in terms of, is this a good law? Is this a bad law? Should you vote yes? Should you vote no? You're not going to hear that from us. You're not going to hear it from any other state agency.
By
either.
State statute, you can't.
By state statute, we can't. And so that's where, no matter what side of an issue you're on, working with your advocacy group to make your voice heard is important, because you can't expect us to be that voice for you.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm here for. To try not get you in trouble, but to advocate for wildlife, hunting opportunity, fishing opportunity, and the habitat that sustains all that. And we have the same thing in my state of Montana. We have the legislature passed a law that our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department can only show up at legislative hearings, at other things, as informational witnesses. They can't say, we support this or we don't support it. And they get a lot of, every state agency that is subject to those legislative confines, I think gets a lot of static from their constituents. Where are you guys on this? You guys are soft. Well, we can't break the law either.
Yes. And for us, when it's in the legislature, like, we're not held quite so tight, but we're still held pretty tight, and maybe not quite as tight as Montana. And so we can generally work through our governor's office for 2 or 3 legislative concepts a session that the governor lets us then advocate for those. And that's things like our budget. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty narrow focus. And so 99% of the time, yes, we're there in an informational capacity, which, takes us further down that route of, and I think some of your comments are like, what's his position or this person in the agency's position on hunting cougars with dogs, it's kind of a moot point.
Yeah, it doesn't
Because if this changes, it would get changed likely through a ballot initiative. We've seen bills introduced to the legislature maybe every full session. And so this happened it's going to be 32 years ago this year.
Wow.
And the legislature's has not had a desire to overturn the will of the voters. I didn't say that in the next election after that bill passed, there was a bill that would have overturned it. And that had it failed by even a wider margin than Measure 18 passed by, with the voters essentially saying, we already spoke, like, listen to us. And so if this were to ever go onto a ballot again, our opinions don't matter. We're managing wildlife within the sideboards that the people of Oregon have given us. And we do the same when the legislature sets those sideboards. Is personal opinions aside, like, this is how we have to complete this work.
Yeah. Well, this is me talking. This is not Brian talking. So I'm aware of a petition that's circulating right now that if it gets, I think what I saw recently, it needs 20 or 22,000 more signatures. There would be a ballot initiative here in Oregon that would have significant consequences if it passed. So my point to this audience in the room, to the audience that's listening, is if that gets the required number of signatures, don't think that your department is here and they are able to legally lead the charge on that ballot initiative. It's going to take all of you who hunt, who fish, who ranch, who raise livestock or chickens or whatever. It's going to take all of you to show up, because legislatively, by statute, most wildlife agencies can't be out there, hey, defeat this or support this or whatever. So you guys got an interesting way of doing business in Oregon.
We do. And maybe you were going to go there, but when we're talking about cougars right now, we have a cougar management plan. That plan was put in place, and we've had a revision or two to that plan. And so those sorts of things go before our commission. And so that commission is a 7-member body that's appointed by the governor, and then those appointments have to be ratified by the Senate. And so they get to make those final decisions. And of course, there's a public process, and there's people on both sides, or many issues have more than 2 sides. They have a couple dozen sides. And so there's people on all different sides of an issue providing input through that public process. And so hunting is one of our tools. We have some other tools that are still in our toolbox for administrative removal, and some of that's around conflict and damage. And there's some circumstances where we can do an administrative removal of a target area to address cougar impacts. But those have gone through that public process, and they're pretty narrowly defined. Yeah. So when we're looking at things like a potential for a target area for elk, well, that's going to mean that we've got a population that's below management objective. It's been below management objective for 3 years. We've got calf ratios within there that are below 23 per 100 for 3 years. And then we can consider doing a target area, but then we're putting $100 into doing that. With deer, there's some criteria there for deer with declines of, I think it's 20% or more over the previous 5 years, and less than 60% of management objective for mule deer. And so we've got some of those tools. We've used some of those tools. We've had mixed success as we have used those tools. But part of my job is to work within those sideboards that I'm assigned to work within.
Yeah. Well, if I lived in Oregon, I would be telling anyone who complained about too many mountain lions the same thing I tell hunters in Montana who complain about too many wolves. How many wolf tags you got, and how many days did you spend wolf hunting last year? Well, that's hard work. Well, that costs money. And it's like, all right, we have these tools of hunting to go do this. Come back to me after you've done something about it. So if I lived in Oregon, I'd be saying, I hope that y'all have, you said you can get 2 cougar tags?
You can get 2. And we've even allowed, so For bear and cougar, we've got a tag sale deadline that corresponds with our primary deer season, that rifle deer season opener, because you got to have a tag to be hunting.
Yeah.
And so we don't want people out there without a tag shooting something and then trying to buy a
Right.
tag. But if you have your cougar tag, you bought it before the deadline, you get a cougar during deer season, we let you then buy that second tag after the deadline if you've harvested on your first, so you got a tag in your pocket for elk season. And we sell somewhere in the vicinity, we might have lost our video feed.
What? We're out of storage. Huh. That's what happens when you let your crew take your cameras out playing. Thanks for the notice on that.
So we might have to turn that camera to you instead of me now.
No, here's what we're going to do, Brian. We're going wide angle on this.
Okay. So with the video fix now,
Yeah.
talking about those cougar tags in that general season, we sell a little bit north of 70,000 cougar tags a year.
Whoa.
It's included within the sports pack for
Yeah.
residents that buy the sports pack, and then of course they're very low price. Success rate's extremely low. Generally going to be less than 1% success rate on people that buy a cougar tag. But for people that actually go out and purposefully look for and hunt for cougar and aren't just have the tag in
Right.
case they encounter one during deer season or elk season, then you can see those success rates start to creep up to 5, 6, 7% on some of
Really?
those. And so if for someone that, really wants to hunt cougars and we've got a healthy population and there's room for harvest there, if you're out looking for tracks in the snow to try to track one down, or you're going to do some predator calling, there is a chance of success there that is much higher than just having that tag in your pocket.
Yeah. Non-residents can come do that
Yes,
for $16 or whatever?
I think it's $16.50 now. So you got to have your hunting license.
Well,
but
yeah,
then,
I already have
but then
that,
putting
'cause
that tag on top of it is
I
pretty
apply
reasonable.
for your controlled hunt. What do you guys call them here? Limited entry or controlled? Or
We call it a controlled hunt.
controlled hunt. I've only drawn one, but now that I know that, I might be like a wood tick on a July bear. You're not going to be able to get rid of me. But, well, that's cool. So with all that, a lot of people want to talk about, and I think we've kind of covered how wildlife that all of you and your agency are charged with. There are sideboards on you from a legislative standpoint, from a ballot initiative standpoint, from a federal standpoint. I mean, you guys have an awful lot of needles you're trying to thread the eye of here, and in doing all that, a lot of people, and then I'll just throw out the other complication is a lot of the habitat that the wildlife you manage, and we're just talking wildlife here. You guys got fisheries, you got freshwater fishery, saltwater fishery, you got waterfowl. We're just mostly focusing on the questions that the audience had at Big Game. But a lot of that habitat, you don't get to tell the BLM or the Forest Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service what to do. You're at the mercy of federal policy, federal, NEPA, ESA, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act. And that was kind of like an accountant there. Accountants feel like they're in the military. We use acronyms all the time. And so that's why I decided I'd really say what those are instead of be an acronym guy. But the habitat part of it is so consequential to what the populations are. And you have very little say over that. You got private timber companies that own a lot of your habitat in this state. So,
yeah, that's very true. And one of the big challenges we have, Oregon's extremely blessed in that I think it's the majority of our state is publicly owned, and that's split between Forest Service and BLM. I think half of our state is forest land, but we're very diverse in terms of our habitat, from coastal Douglas fir and spruce rainforest to our Cascade, dominated by by Douglas fir, and then you get into eastern Oregon, and you get into those ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine forests in the Blue Mountains. You've also got the basin and range sagebrush type habitat, very dry, arid, and so a lot of diversity in the habitat and a lot of diversity in the ownership. And so one of the things that our staff do, and do a great job of it, but also aren't the decision makers on it, is working with those landowners, those land managers, to try to see habitat projects done in a way that's going to be beneficial to wildlife, and sustainable, like best use of resources. So we definitely weigh in, and we're very engaged in that. But at the end of the day, there's things like NEPA and federal things that might stop some good projects from going forward that would have benefited a suite of species, but because of impacts to other species or just the complexity of some of the federal laws, that they just don't come to fruition.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I can speak to with my own observations is I went to college in Reno, just south of, in the state that borders you on the south. I spent so much time in the whole Sheldon, Heart Mountain area of southeast Oregon, northeast or northwest Nevada. I am blown away every time I go back to that country. And my son, people are going to think he had the deck rigged. He drew a random pronghorn tag with only 4 points. That guy he can be so lucky. Well, we went and hunted down there. In the amount of cheatgrass, which if you look at what the habitat was when I was stomping that country in my college days in the late 80s to now 40 years later, the carrying capacity of that habitat just because of cheatgrass, not to mention horses, wild feral horses, pinyon juniper encroachment. I look at that and I'm like, how do any deer or pronghorn live out here when the BLM ground is in this situation for the most of this that we were hunting with BLM ground? And it's just really a huge change. And so the carrying capacity, if anyone thinks we're getting back to 1960 before cheatgrass showed up and before the Wild Horse and Burro Act there's another one you guys got to deal with, right?
Yep.
The Wild Horse and Burro Act. You can't just say, oh, we're going to manage these horses out of here. That's federally controlled.
Yep.
And so you get to all those things, and I look at it, and I'm just trying to think of how do you quantify or even catalog habitat quality and quantity today versus what it was when we always think about the good old days. It's hard.
You bring up, boy, we could unpack that for about
let's do
4 or 5 hours, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have that much time, but no, I love that desert country too. Spent some time working in Southeast Oregon. It was heartbreaking because it felt like you were watching the desert die and couldn't do anything about it. You had all these things going on that were just overwhelming. And cheatgrass is one of those where you have these invasive annual grasses. It's cheatgrass, Medusa head, ventonata. And for people that don't have the expertise to know what they're looking at, they look out across that landscape and they say nothing's changed in the last 40, 50 years. And the reality is that I think 25% of our Great Basin range is heavily impacted by those invasive annual grasses. Those grasses take moisture that would otherwise be supporting sagebrush and bitterbrush, and at the higher elevations, mountain mahogany, and instead is putting that into a very quick growing grass that provides very, very little nutrition to anything. And then that grass cures out early. It burns up, it changes the fire regime, it carries that fire uniform across the landscape. So the old bunch grass and sagebrush dominated system with mosaics of burns that allowed for regeneration of bunch grasses, regeneration of shrubs that are those highly palatable, highly nutritious, instead are a fire that's all consuming, burns up everything and turns into cheatgrass. And after 2 or 3 of those, you've depleted your seed source. And so, BLM have some wonderful people working for them, but budget's what they are, and the challenges that you have, you're not gonna be able to go spray an annual grass herbicide across 200,000 acres because some of our fires are getting that big now.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a budget to go in and try to do a replant, and it's going to fully depend on whether or not you got fall moisture this year. And if that fall moisture didn't come, that was your rehab money that you put in the ground, and moisture didn't come, and now you don't have another shot at it.
Wow.
And so you slowly watch that go away. And then, we see that in a lot of our ungulate populations is, you talked about carrying capacity. In a lot of places, we're seeing those carrying capacity effects where you want to have a certain number of animals on the landscape, but that's going to mean increasing that habitat capacity because it's just not there. But we could unpack this all day. But we look at things like a really bad winter and a population gets knocked down. A population that's been stable, maybe slightly decreasing, slightly increasing, and this is not just Oregon, but across, like say deer range. Yep. You get that bad winter, a population drops way down, and then they become very productive for a while because that population was knocked below what like a carrying capacity would be, a long-term carrying capacity, and so reproductive rates go up, and your deer are especially healthy because there's less competition. But often we're not seeing that happen after these. Like populations are up against carrying capacity, and that carrying capacity is continuing to decline as these invasive annual grasses spread, as western juniper encroaches into a native species,
right,
but invading some of the lowlands in places where it's now absorbing all that water and killing off those good forage species, those good shrubs. And so that carrying capacity slowly drops, and you have a winter event, and you don't have that gap between your population and carrying capacity for that robust response, and then it just slowly dwindles down. And so our staff are working hard with partners to try to remedy this stuff. We've done a lot of work with Oregon State University on trying to develop some more effective annual grass herbicide applications using, in particular, one of our Eastern Oregon wildlife areas that's been impacted by repeated fire in mule deer winter range and has all of those three main Medusa head, cheatgrass, ventnata. I'm trying to find a better way to apply herbicides that will knock that down, let us get natives reestablished and get the foothold so that we can get those critical shrubs back, critical forbs back, critical bunch grasses back in the environment.
Yeah.
And I didn't even take the horse bait, but we can go there later if you want.
You don't need to take the horse bait. Everyone who listens to this podcast has heard the horse story a lot.
I've got one for you though. In Oregon, one of our horse herds in the South Steens, I think what's been identified as the herd management level, sustainable herd management level for those horses is it's around 150 to like 300. Those horses got so far above that there was a gather in 2022, and then again in 2024. I think they gathered up about 1,500 horses across a 3-year period there, on a herd range that is supposed to be managed around 300 horses.
Wow.
And then I talk with people, love those conversations, but it's like nothing's changed on that mountain. And it's like, well, there's like well over 1,000 horses that weren't there 40, 50 years ago. And we've got juniper, most winter range areas that have not burned, and where it has burned, it's all cheatgrass. And so, you see these things and you're trying to work on them, trying to help raise the awareness, because when you just go out there, it looks wide open. There's not subdivisions, there's not parking lots, there's not those obvious habitat losses. It's that fine scale, the habitat quality just isn't there like it used to be 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think about, and I don't know if there's a comparison to this in Oregon, but I love hunting in Nevada. And so I always try to go back there when I can. But when I was there in the late 80s, they had 265,000 mule deer. And then along comes 30, 40 years of cheatgrass, just impacts of horses that it's not, people think these landscapes out there are really resilient. They're very fragile, actually. And if you overgraze them with thousands of horses, and you convert how many AUMs a herd of horses is compared to a small group of mule deer, it's a significant impact. So they went from 265,000 mule deer to now about 70,000. And the question is that really what our carrying capacity is in Nevada? So I don't know how that would equate across the border here in Oregon, but what that means for my audience who loves to hunt, that means we got maybe 28, 30% of the number of animals we had before. So that means we got rid of 2 out of every 3 tags for opportunity. And you can talk predators all you want. You can talk disease all you want. You can talk winters all you want. But you're not going to shoot your way into better habitat. And I don't know if there's an equivalent to that here in Oregon about what has happened to your mule deer numbers, because the next place we're going to take this is all the questions that people have about your new mule deer.
Yeah, and we can jump into some of that. We've seen some of those same, roughly 50% decline in mule deer over the last 50 years. Our number's not quite as low as Nevada. Some of our forest habitats can carry higher densities, and so we're probably around plus or minus 170,000 mule deer in Oregon right now, which is, for people that saw the heyday of mule deer in the 40s, 50s, maybe into 60s a little bit, like that's half of what we had back then. And there's so much that's impacting them. There's no one silver bullet. And there's a lot of question about, okay, so how do we figure out where to best put those limited resources we have? How do we leverage our resources to bring in other outside dollars to make a difference? What are the actions that we can take? What are the actions that are outside of our control? And so when do we, take this action, even though it may not be the action that's like the driver, but it's an action that now becomes within our control. And some of those actions, like we reduce deer tags, we have almost no mule deer doe harvest anymore, except in places where we have agriculture and agricultural issues. And you're a lot safer when you're hunting bucks. Like you're not going to have those impacts on the population. Right. You can get all your does pregnant with a very low buck ratio. And so we're taking some of those very conservative approaches, but then we're also, we put together our mule deer plan, and maybe I'll spend a little bit of time talking about it. Really proud of the work that our staff did, and we spent years kind of preparing for this. We had been managing mule deer on these wildlife management units that were really a way to distribute hunters and a way to communicate to the public about what our objectives are. And so we had wintering deer management objectives for each wildlife management unit, and that's the scale that we tried to model populations. The deer didn't care what those boundaries were. They went from winter range to summer range, and so a great example, and we knew that, and so even clear back in the 1960s, in the Fort Rock unit, we put ear tags in a bunch of bucks, we being the people before me, but we put ear tags in a bunch of bucks and then looked at where those bucks got harvested at, and I think they got harvested in 9 different wildlife management units. And so we're trying to model what's the wintering population in Fort Rock. We're trying to meet buck ratio objectives, and so those are our escapement objectives that are our way to tell the public, like, here's what we're managing this area for. And so if our buck ratio is, say, 15 bucks per 100 does postseason, that's the target, where when we're below that, you're going to see us reduce tags. When we're above that, we're going to be able to issue more tags. And so whether it's now, 15, 20, and 25 is the 3 tiers that we use. And so when you're trying to do that within a wintering population, that's then going off into 9 different wildlife management units that might have different buck ratio objectives, and you're trying to tease that out, that becomes impossible.
Yeah.
And so as we look at, well, we do these actions, we might do a cougar target area, or we do habitat actions, and we try to look for that response in the deer population. Well, we're treating just a small portion of a population and then trying to pick that up on a winter range when they've intermingled with deer from other wildlife management areas. And so we collared, I think it was close to 1,500 mule deer across the state, tracked those deer, used that to delineate the herd ranges and figure out where our distinct herd ranges are. And we identified 22 different herd ranges. We realized that not everybody trusts their state agency, and so we contracted with some of the modeling experts in the West, actually a private group out of Montana that worked with us to develop population models for each of those. And so we feel like we're really now setting ourselves up in this place where as we take actions on the ground, we've got a much better chance of seeing what the effect of that is and make those decisions about, okay, if we put our money here and we do these actions, yes, that's having a positive response, or no, it's not, so that we can use our money wisely, but also have that positive effect on deer. That does come with some changes to hunting, because those models really do take into account what that hunter effort and harvest is, and that matters for the model and helps gauge what's going on with that population. And so we've had to restructure hunting seasons, hunting boundaries, unit boundaries that have been in place since I think the 50s or 60s. And change is hard. Change is hard for me.
It is for me.
Change is hard for my staff, and change is hard for the public. And so we're going through that right now, and putting a lot of resources together to help hunters figure out, but we really need to be hunting our deer within that herd range scale so that data can feed our models, makes those models more accurate. That's the scales at which we're doing our monitoring. And for each of these herd ranges now with this new plan, we've got, as an appendix to the plan, herd range reports where we detail each of the herd ranges, kind of what that population's doing, what the buck ratio is, what we've seen for fawn ratios and population numbers, but then identify these are the actions that we're looking to take in this herd range, and we'll be able to update those every couple of years as we try actions, see if they work, see if they don't work, like what's that next thing we're going to do, and trying to be transparent. Unfortunately, I can't remember how long that plan is, but it's long.
Yeah.
It's a long read. But for folks that maybe don't want to spend the time sitting down, reading through that from cover to cover, like the executive summary is great. We've got a summary chapter at the end that is where we put all of those kind of key actions, key issues affecting mule deer and what our actions can be, we put in there, and then really take a look at those herd range reports at the end and see like what our biologists in the field think we need to be doing within those individual ranges.
Wow, that's a big change. If someone tried to do such a wholesale change to mule deer hunting in Montana, there'd be a lot of kicking and screaming along the way.
There's been a little bit of that in Oregon. We'll see if I get strung up when I'm working the booth off and on through this show. And it's a tough change, but it was necessary. We need to use the best science we have. We relied on a lot of Oregon science, and change is hard. I get it. I wish it didn't have to be hard, but I think when we get down the road and we look back, we're going to find that this put us in a much better place to address this long-term decline that we're seeing. Nevada's seeing, a lot of other states, essentially range-wide mule deer are seeing this decline.
Yeah. So when I do my application on I'll do mine before May 15th. That's your deadline here, right? May 15th?
May 15th. Please do it before May 15th.
Yeah.
Don't wait till the last day to look at, where you want to put in for your mule deer hunt. Please do it a few weeks early.
So all of the places that I've in my head thought about the last 6 or 7 years. They're going to have different names and different units and different geographically. The boundaries might be wider or might be different. Season dates staying similar.
Yes.
Okay.
So season dates are going to stay pretty similar. As you mentioned, we've got a lot of great bounty here in Oregon. We do. And so when you look at the calendar and you've got an archery season for deer and elk, you've got a rifle season for deer, and in order to keep hunter densities where people want them, you separate that out from your elk seasons.
Okay.
So you don't have people that are out there with an elk tag and a deer tag on top of people that have just an elk tag and on top of people that just have a deer tag. That can get crowded. And so when you look at that calendar, it's pretty full. There's not many holes in it. That has its own impacts on mule deer when it comes to disturbance and elk, and creates some challenges for us, but we didn't like wholesale switch to new time periods. It's pretty similar.
Okay.
Rifle buck seasons still start the first Saturday in October. And so there's a range there, essentially October 1st through October 6th or so, depending on where the calendar falls. And then we backdate for archery seasons, and then work kind of forward from there for elk seasons and stuff.
Yeah, and people, from my experience of looking at your mule deer regs, I got to choose if I want to hunt with a bow or hunt with a rifle or hunt with a muzzleloader. I ask that,
Yep.
Brian, because there's a lot of people who will listen to this who live in states like Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, where all I can conclude in Montana, we must hate mule deer because we get to hunt them with a bow for 6 weeks on a general tag I can buy at the hardware store. And if I don't fill my tag then, I can come back with a rifle for 5 weeks with a rifle in the peak of the rut of November. And if I don't fill my tag with those 2 seasons, I can still come back for a 3rd season for 10 days of muzzleloader hunting. So any of you from Oregon, I know I'm looking at, they're all like, man, I'm going to pack my bags. I'm renting a U-Haul, man. I'm going to Montana or Idaho or Wyoming. But I also want that to be context of people who do live in some of those states where we have it really good of how, because of resident population growth, because of impacts of the habitat on your mule deer herd, you guys have had to adopt a way more restrictive season structure than you probably had 40 years ago.
Yes, and I don't want to make myself feel too old here, but I'm getting old, and I'll admit that. But as a kid, when I was young, we were still in that day when you could hunt mule deer with a general season tag. The mule deer season dates were shorter than the blacktail dates, and so you could go east and hunt for a week or two. And if you didn't get your mule deer, then you could go to the west side and hunt the rest of the blacktail season with your rifle. We've got a lot of people. We've got some wonderful wildlife populations, but they're not always as big as we want. And so if we let people hunt multiple weapons, multiple seasons, then that means that there'd be fewer people that would have the chance to hunt. And as we talk with our hunters, and we've done some hunter surveys to try to see what our hunters are most interested in, things that come up most consistently as a priority for hunters, what's most important for both deer and elk hunters, is spending time with family and friends, spending time having the opportunity to hunt, spending the time afield, enjoying nature, and those are important. And so if I said, hey, Randy, you're going to get to hunt deer with archery, rifle, and muzzleloader, well, that's going to mean that you're probably going to hunt deer less often. You're going to hunt maybe once every 10 years instead of once every 3 or 4 years, because everybody else gets to do that too. And so is it perfect? No. There's people that have different ideas or would do it different, but we try to balance this broad range. Same with our management objectives for bucks, is we have with this plan, targets of $15 per 100 does, $20 per 100 does, $25 per 100 postseason.
Wow.
And so if you want to apply for a unit that's got a $25 per 100 doe postseason ratio, you're probably not going to draw that very frequently unless it's the most hard to get to steep wilderness country that people just can't get into, because you have to have pretty low hunter densities to hit that. And so we try to have that mix, but also recognize that most people want a chance to go.
Yeah. Well, that's always the challenge that you face in an agency. You wish you could tell everybody, hey, yeah, we'll do everything you want, but you have to protect that resource for today and the future. And Randy doesn't get what he wants all the time. I wish they had over-the-counter sheep tags, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon. But
if it makes you feel better, I can't draw a sheep tag either. But I try.
Yeah. Oh, I try too. I've tried here in Oregon a lot. I don't know. You guys don't want my money or what the deal is. I've tried in my home state of Montana. This will be my 35th or 36th application for sheep in Montana. I have 20-some points in Arizona, in Nevada, Utah. I guess I'm just not going sheep hunting.
Yeah, and that's like you're going down the points world too. Like we made that conscious decision with sheep and goats, recognizing that if we went down the preference point world, then people that weren't applying in the very first year, so kids that are born and want to get into hunting, they're not going to have a chance at this. And so for those that, we have one tag for every 200 to 300, 400 people that want one, that's just going to be a strict random draw.
Yeah. Well, when Montana came up with its point system in the late 90s, I sat on that committee. I was the youngest person on that committee. Back then, I didn't have gray hair. Let's see. In 1998, I would have been 34 years old. And I was one of those weirdos who had been applying in states all across the West. So somehow Governor Roscoe put me on that committee, along with a bunch of other people. And we brought in all these number scientists. And they said, you know what? All these point schemes and everything aren't putting more sheep or moose or goats on the mountain. You're kind of kidding yourself if you think some point scheme is going to solve this demand problem, because everybody who gets in at the first step on the ladder and starts working their way up, 20 years from now, you're going to have a big pool of people here with a lot of points, and it's going to be slanted in their favor. And so I proposed in Montana that at least half of our tags stay outside a point system, and they should just be random. Oh my gosh, I thought I was going to get beat up out in the parking lot after I made that suggestion, because there are a bunch of old geezers there. Oh, I will never draw my third sheep tag if I don't have that. And so, one of the things I worry about with point schemes, I call them schemes, they're like Ponzi schemes, is it makes hunters lose focus on how important habitat and management and all the other things are. Like somehow a point scheme solves all that. And it doesn't. If anything, it takes our eye off the bigger picture of what is habitat. Do you ever do any your interaction or discussion with Dr. Kevin Monteith in Wyoming on their mule deer stuff? The reason I asked, he was my previous podcast guest, just released it the other day.
Okay.
And he loves to hunt, just like most agency people love to hunt and fish. And he said, Randy, it's all about having fat does. If you got the quantity and quality of habitat that makes fat does, all the other problems are solved. The herd resilience to predation and disease and winters, quantity will get better, quality will get better. Just make sure you got the habitat for fat does. I'm like, Kevin, why haven't I known this for a long time? I need a bumper sticker. Want fat does, wanted fat does. And but his point was that he was trying to think of, how do I get hunters to understand the point schemes and antler point restrictions and all the other stuff that just flirts around the edge, does nothing compared to quality and quantity of habitat.
Yeah, he was exactly right. And I want fat does too. And we recognize that we need fat does. And unfortunately, as we look at our deer, we find that we don't have the fat does that we need, and there's impacts to that. And maybe we'll kind of get into that in a minute.
Yeah.
And so point schemes, season lengths, whether you let people use a bow and then a rifle or have to pick and choose, those are really just ways that you're kind of divvying out what's available for harvest and who gets to harvest. And it's not about growing more. It's not gonna end up with more. Like one of the benefits to using preference points is, for us, 20% of our tags for deer and elk hunts go random, 25%, and then 75% go to the top point holders that apply. And so you build in some of that ability to draw for a new hunter, but sometimes the chance is pretty low. But you also provide that assurance that if you're the most unlucky person in the world, and sometimes I am, eventually, if I'm unlucky longer than everybody else, then I'm going to get that tag, and I can expect that. But that's really around managing those social demands that people want to see, and that's what our point system, we were directed by the legislature to set up a point system that essentially, I can't remember the exact words that was used, but essentially you're providing assurances that people that were unsuccessful in the drawing have a better chance of success in the future drawings. And so that's what our point system was meant to do. And in this case, like, we don't have the option of saying we don't want to run a point system, because it was important to hunters, and they worked with their legislators to say, no, we want to have some assurances that this person over here is not going to draw 5 times in 10 years while I am unlucky and don't draw for 15.
Yeah. Well, in Montana, we put it out there and it operated. And one of the things that was considered, and this has nothing to do with Oregon mule deer, but it has a lot to do with hunter expectations and perceptions, is we had a number scientist who did probability and statistics, and we considered the idea of squaring bonus points. And they're like, well, for species where you don't churn through the applicant pool every 4 to 5 years, you are wasting your time by squaring bonus points. So we rejected that. 10 years later, what'd the legislature do? Bunch of old gray hairs like me are like, well, we need a bill. We need to square my bonus points. Heck with all those new hunters. If I got 20, that gives me 400 random numbers. That new hunter only has 2 points. They only get 4 random numbers. And so things like that, hunters distract themselves from the stuff that you're talking about, the things that make up a mule deer management plan. It's just the human condition, I guess. We want easy solutions to complicated problems. And there's not a lot more complicated than managing for robust mule deer numbers across variety of landscapes, variety of land ownership patterns, in the face of a whole lot of things where you don't have all the tools to get it done. But I'm glad you guys take it on. I mean,
sometimes we're a glutton for punishment, and take on things that aren't easy. And maybe if you want to, we can want to talk to you a little bit about some of the research we're doing and some of the things we've done. A lot of the questions that I saw on your Facebook page were around predators and predator impacts to ungulates, and we talked about the history of cougars earlier. But to kind of take that to the ungulate discussion, I mentioned that we can do things like target areas, and I get asked a lot, like, why don't we have more target areas, or what's gonna result in doing a target area to remove cougars. And so we've done target areas for a variety of different reasons, and we've had mixed success. I kind of alluded to that earlier. And so with elk, there's times where we've seen elk calf ratios drop into the teens for consecutive years, and cougars really can focus their predation on calves with elk, and so you can see those impacts on calves. There's a lot of other things that affect calf ratios. And so we've had some success with target areas in the past in raising calf ratios from that kind of mid-teens level, calves per 100 cows, into like maybe the mid-20s. When it comes to mule deer, we've struggled with that a little bit more, showing that positive benefit where we've done target areas. One of them we did, I think we've done about 7, maybe 8 target areas now for the benefit of mule deer. Like one of those was in the Steens unit. We had a target area, I think, started in 2010. Between 2010 and 2013 or so, 2014, we took maybe 60 cougars out of there, took a couple years off, and then started another target area. Over that time, I think we took close to 100 cougars over about 9 years, to supplement what was being taken by hunters to try to get back a mule deer population that used to be one of the prides of Oregon, is like that Steens Mountain mule deer herd. And over that 10 years, we didn't have enough impact to increase buck tags for rifle by a single tag. Wow. And so just didn't see that response. And so right now, we want to know when we do these things, because they're controversial. Target areas were the most controversial part of our cougar plan, and they get a lot of scrutiny. And so we're doing a couple of research projects right now that are big, they're expensive. It's going to take a little bit of time to get results. But in 2 of our mule deer herds, we're doing big studies where we're collaring does. We're getting doe weights and fat levels. And then when they give birth, we have the vaginal implant transmitters, and we're catching the fawns, and we're collaring the fawns and looking at fawn survival, looking at fawn weights at birth. And then again in the fall, we catch them to look at how much weight those fawns gained over the course of the summer. Also look at weights of those marked does going into winter and see what that overwinter survival is. And so we're looking at nutrition, and how does nutrition impact doe body condition? How does that doe body condition affect fawn birth weights? How does that habitat and body condition affect fawn growth through the summer and going into winter? And so we're trying to get that picture of nutrition, and at the same time then looking at predator numbers. And so we're doing density estimates, density studies on bears, cougars, coyotes, bobcats. So the suite of predators, because we don't have just cougars, we don't have just coyotes, we don't have just wolves. We've got a whole suite of predators. And so trying to tease out, like, when are you going to have some effect controlling coyote populations or controlling cougar populations? When is that not going to matter? You need to be all in on habitat and fixing that habitat. And I'll tell you, and so we've got 2 study areas, so we can compare between those 2, and we can compare within them. So where there's higher densities of, say, coyotes and a lower density of cougar, how does that compare with survival in another part of that study area where maybe it's a little swapped, a little bit reversed, and that's going to help us understand. But one of the big things that we've seen through not just us, but Forest Service, and we've got the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, which has really given us a lot of great information about elk and road impacts to elk and people impacts, disturbance impacts from motor vehicles, and some of those things have, I think, really helped wildlife managers across the West as we try to reduce those disturbances so animals can utilize that good habitat that's there and not get pushed off of it. But we look at some of that long-term trends in plant phenology, so that kind of plant growth when it's actively growing, when it's most nutritious. And we've lost 2 to 3 weeks of our growing season on our grasses and forbs. And the most critical part of that is we're losing it from that lactation period. And so our forbs and our grasses are drying out, and they're becoming less palatable and less nutritious, while we have does and cows trying to produce milk for those offspring, and that's going to have a huge impact. And I know climate change and climate is can be very polarizing.
Yep.
We're sitting here in Oregon on the West Coast with the Pacific Ocean right off of our coast. And as that ocean temperature changes, we're seeing changes in oxygen levels in the ocean. We're seeing changes in fish distribution. At the sports show, I was just talking to someone who said, like, last year, every week, someone was catching a marlin somewhere off the Oregon coast, and
Wow.
that shouldn't be happening. And that affects our rainfall patterns and our temperatures and our
Right.
plants inland. And then that's affecting the milk production of does and cows. And those things, like, they scare me.
Yeah. Well, anyone who researched even slightly into the caloric demands of a lactating female, whether it's a cow or a cow elk or a mule deer, know that 40 to 60% increase during that lactation period, sometime towards the end of August. And that's why they are looking for the best food source on that landscape on that day, because it changes throughout the period of lactation of that, say, close to 3-month period. And if we're disturbing them, which this gets into a whole nother subject of year-round recreation.
Yep.
I mean, you folks in Oregon love being out recreating like we do in Montana. But one of the consequences to that is the mule deer who's trying to be the fat doe and trying to raise a fat fawn is getting bumped every day because of, a hiker or whoever it is using that landscape. So as your resident population here in Oregon has grown and your habitat has been compromised by all the things we talked about earlier, the disturbance level of humans to the mule deer, using just mule deer as the example, and pushing them to the marginal habitat, is going to have a pretty predictable outcome to the quality and health of those fawns. And how are they going to survive predation? How are they going to survive winters? How are they going to survive disease? And there's just a lot of complicated things. This is not a simple, if we had a point restriction on, 3-point or better on bucks, that's going to solve all the things that you and I have just covered. Or if we, whatever you might, if we completely got rid of rifle hunting and made, whatever, there's too much harvest from rifle hunting, that's not going to change it. It's all these little things that hunters, as a general rule, ask agencies to do. I always say it's like our house is on fire and we're out in the front lawn picking the dandelions out of the grass. Well, the house is burning down right over our shoulder. My point of that is the house is the habitat.
Yep.
And the dandelions are all these other little things we want to focus on. And
Yep.
so,
It's very true. And we just did a workshop with our commission in December talking about all these complexities, focused a little bit on predation, but talked about this whole suite of factors that's influencing things. And as I kind of prepared for that, like, there were some big takeaways. We have 11 national forests in Oregon. The biggest one's the Willamette. The Willamette has enough roads to stretch from like where we're at here to New York City and back throughout that forest. When we look at mule deer and we look, especially wintering mule deer, and we look at how they react to open roads, you have avoidance out to 2 kilometers where they're avoiding open roads. And then you look at the amount of roads we have and you see we have some real habitat issues. Some of it's habitat quality, some of it's habitat quantity, but some of it is that habitat is just not accessible because the deer won't be there,
right.
because we're a predator too, and they're avoiding us and they're avoiding our motor vehicles. And one thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is, for deer, when your habitat quality is down and your doe health is down, if it's really down, it might affect pregnancies. But what you really affect is your fawn birth rates. And so most of your does are going to get bred. They're going to have twins. You're going to put, two deer on the landscape. Your deer population doubles every June, right? Yeah. Is what it comes down to when you talk about all your adult does putting 2 fawns on the ground. And your habitat effects are often seen in that fawn birth weight and maybe that doe survival and her health in the winter. But with elk, it can be different. And so we see, and this is confounding. So when you look at predation, and so how big of an impact are you going to have removing, say, cougars and reducing predation on calves? Well, when our habitat's poor, you look at the timing of elk reproduction, it's in September. And so you're putting a calf on the ground in May, maybe early June. That cow is then putting all of her resources into milk production. She's now trying to produce milk on dry grass and dry forbs that are not very nutritious. And when her milk sacs start drying up and she starts weaning that calf, she's got to immediately turn around and go into estrus. And so what we find is when habitat's bad, elk cows have to take a year off, and they don't breed every year.
Oh, wow.
And so you say, oh, wow, like people don't realize that. And so there was some work done. And when you looked at elk in some of the dairy farm areas where they're coming down into fertilized pasture, when you looked at pregnancy rates of lactating cows, it was 100%. Every cow that's old enough to have a calf is getting bred every single year. Parts of our Central Coast range, the pregnancy rate of lactating cows was 20%. 1 in 5 cows had enough health condition to have a calf, raise that calf, provide that milk, and still go into estrus. And 4 out of 5 had to take a year off. And so then, like, what's your effect of predation, right? Well, if you have a calf born and that calf gets eaten early, well, then the milk production dries up. The cow gets to put body condition on, gets to add some fat, and she's going to go into estrus in September, and she's going to have another calf next year. But if she raises that calf, she's going to take a year off. And so a calf getting eaten may not have an impact on the population long term because it got eaten this year, but another one was born next year. But the timing of that predation matters. If that calf gets killed in September when she's already put all that energy into it, right, she now lost that calf, and now she doesn't get pregnant because she put all of her energy into that calf, and now she's taking that next year off anyway. It gets really complicated, and there's some huge variables at play. And a lot of them, even that predation comes back to, like, what is that body condition? What is that habitat? And that's not to say predation doesn't matter, and that's not to say predation doesn't have effects, but it's not simple math. Right. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. You've got all these other factors.
Yeah. Well, predation is, every study I've read, whether, no matter pronghorn, mule deer, whitetails, elk, the consequences or the impacts of predation are amplified greatly when habitat is compromised, whether it's the quality of the habitat, quantity of the habitat, or it's the habitat's there, but like you were saying, they just aren't using it because there's too much human activity. Every one of those conditions results in a higher, if you look at the wavelengths of up and down of predation, it's way more amplified. And that's an accountant reading it, but every biologist I talk to is like, if you want to reduce the impacts of predation, increase the quality of your habitat.
Yep. And that's not to say predator management isn't important.
Oh,
and the
yeah,
predator management
I do it all the time.
Can't buy you some time.
Yeah.
But if that's where you're going to put all your investment, you're probably not going to have those big impacts that you want to have. Even with our cougar target areas for elk, I remember I was a young biologist, and we got elk calf ratios in the mid-teens, and the senior researcher saying, you all want to get back to 40 calves per 100 cows and 50 calves per 100 cows, and the target area is necessary. Like, population's dropping real fast, and you're going to have a positive impact, but you're probably not going to get your calf ratio above 30. Because that's where you're going to be limited by these environmental factors. And that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but get your expectations right. And then we ended up at like 25 or 27. And it's like, yeah, when you really look at those habitat limiting factors, it helps you kind of ground your reality of what your impacts are going to be with your different actions. It's one of the things I'm most excited about with our mule deer plan is being able to really evaluate those actions with much more accurate modeling at the proper scale, the biological scale. And it gives me some hope for the future. But I think that we've got a lot of challenges.
Well, I'm going to pluck a couple of these Facebook questions, and you walked me through. I don't know if this is correct, but somebody said that Oregon has 7,000 cougars, and a cougar eats 52 times a year. So they did the math, they multiplied that, and they said that means that cougars eat 364,000 deer a year. In my head, I'm like, well, how are there any deer left if that math is true? Is that is that an oversimplification?
That's a little bit of an oversimplification and a little bit of a misunderstanding of our population estimates. And so most states run a cougar model, and they're reporting how many adult cougars they have.
Yep.
And so our cougar model, we're reporting the total number of cougars across all age classes. And so we have 7,000 cougars in Oregon, according to our model. And I think it's probably a pretty good model, but that means we have between 3,000 and 4,000 adults. And so an adult cougar, on average, kills one animal per week. But then what animal it takes matters. And so when it's taking a calf or a fawn in springtime, that type of predation is more likely to be compensatory because, so now a cougar grabbed this fawn and if it hadn't of, maybe a coyote would have got it, or a bear would have got it, or it would have got hung up in a fence, or
vehicle accident, or
got separated from mom because of a four-wheeler and don't get matched back up together. And so you have, half your fawns that are born aren't going to make it past the first 90 days of life is kind of what you figure. And so predation there doesn't have the same impact as it does on, say, an adult doe, or an animal, a fawn that's made it most of the way through. And so, it's about one per week, but it's more frequent than that when they're eating small prey in the summer, eating fawns, eating calves. It's much less than that when they're preying on something in December or January. Those predations have a bigger impact on your population, but they're not doing it as often because it's cold. That meat will stay good. They can return to feed on it. It doesn't go bad like it does in June or July, and it's bigger than everything that they take then is bigger body size, and so it's going to last longer than taking a real small fawn in June. So there's nuance to that. But that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that I see with our cougar model is just it's 7,000, but that's 3,000 to 4,000 adults, and there's a lot of young of the year and year and a half old cougars in there that are still traveling with mom, and don't have that same kill rate as an adult does.
Okay, so as an accountant, I'm always worried about the numbers and making sure I'm correct and accurate. I'm not sure if the person who wrote that was an accountant. This one I can almost answer, I think, Brian, but I want your input. Someone made reference to ODFW, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, reintroducing wolves into Oregon. Now, as someone who was involved in all the reintroduction in Montana, trying to negotiate the best deal we could get, because we knew we were getting wolves. We knew they were going to travel across landscapes, and the dirty little secret was we knew wolves were already showing up in parts of Montana from Canada and elsewhere. So it's like, well, if we're going to get wolves, let's get the best deal possible. But our state wildlife agency has never said, oh, we're going to go and throw some wolves in the middle of this spot or the middle of that spot. Is this comment this one person left about you guys moving wolves around the landscape? What was the term? Reintroducing wolves? You reintroduced wolves to Oregon.
Yeah,
if I had to guess, I'd say they came across the Snake River from Idaho, but
yeah, and so wolves have ability to move a long ways, and that's the one where people call me a liar and call me a liar to my face. We have not ever released wolves into Oregon. Now, when we catch a wolf and put a collar on it and release it where we caught it, like that's when we would release a wolf. But we've never brought wolves in and moved them into Oregon. We haven't moved them around the state. They've got some amazing dispersal mechanisms, and the
Yeah.
distances they can go is crazy. But wolves came across, most of our wolves have genetic ties back to Idaho. But at this point, we've got wolves that were born in Oregon, went to California, started packs in California. Some of those young are coming back to Oregon from California. We have wolves crossing back and forth across the border with Washington and from Idaho. There was a wolf in Oregon that went all the way down in California, like what I'd call like Southern California, like incredible distances. Maybe looking for a mate, maybe just looking, going on a run. That's what they do.
Yeah.
And that's where our wolves came from,
Yeah.
is just coming from those Rocky Mountain states and those Rocky Mountain populations. And quite frankly, with the distances we've seen them move, it's quite possible that you'd have wolves from Canada that could make it into Oregon on their dispersal trip, well within the distance that those wolves can travel.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people, we got an abundance of grizzly bears in Montana. So if you guys want to restore some of those, we'll pay the freight. We'll even pay the price to get them captured and brought over. But no one here in this audience is nodding their head in a affirmative.
Yeah, we see there's been articles in magazines and newspapers about the potential for grizzly bear reintroduction in the North Cascades of Washington.
Right. Yeah.
And so every time one of those comes about, then the emails come in like, how can you be thinking about putting grizzly bears in Oregon? And it's like, the Cascades don't stop at the Columbia River. That mountain range continues on into Washington, and those discussions are, really northern Washington discussions, and we're part of no discussions with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about that in Oregon, and aren't looking at that at all.
Yeah. No, when it comes to certain species, the amount of things you hear and read is quite varied. And I've found that wolves and grizzly bears are the two lightning rods. No matter where I go, no matter what I talk about, someone's going to tell me how it is about wolves and grizzly bears. And I listen to them, but I've been pretty involved in a lot of that stuff for 30 years. And I'm like, I think I'm going to ask somebody who would really know. I usually have a pretty good feel, but, if you read it on Facebook, it's got to be true. So here's another one. This guy, I made a couple of references to this earlier, and I talked to biologists about it because I used to really be big on this idea. And they kept sending me these studies in this state, study in that state. Finally, I concluded that maybe I just was wishing for something that isn't going to happen. Making it a 3-point or better unit for all adult hunters would improve buck management and improve population numbers. The old antler point restriction idea.
Yeah.
That came up a couple times.
Yeah, we've had antler point restrictions in the past, and we still have some now for elk, really because biologically there's no benefit to it, but socially that becomes very hard. And so we still have some of those. But when it comes to deer, what really matters is that you have enough bucks to breed your does, and that can be a surprisingly low number of bucks. And when we tried doing some antler point restrictions for deer, Steens Mountain was one of those places where it had to be a 4-point or larger. You're doing that because you want to grow more 4 points, but what you're doing is you're putting all your hunter pressure on what you want to keep. Yeah. And so you're telling a hunter, like, there's a great big 25-inch wide 3-point. You got to pass on that to shoot a 4-point, and they stay longer, they hunt longer, and we believe we even saw a shift to a higher proportion of 3-points in that population, because if you were a big 28-inch wide 3-point buck, you were never available to harvest, and so if there's a genetic reason why you're a 3-point or a big forked horn, if there's a reason for that, well, then you're going to pass that on because you're going to get a breed when the big ones don't. And we didn't find more. Where where we see antler point restrictions help some, but it's not what people necessarily think is the purpose. But with some of our elk units, we have a lot of pressure to keep some 3-point or better bag limits, and we manage on buck and bull ratios as an escapement. And so what that does is says, well, okay, we can have a pretty high bull ratio objective, and to meet that, you either reduce hunter numbers, so that you have that escapement. Biologically, that's the best way to do it, because then you have a distribution across age classes, or you can meet that with young animals, and so you can have more hunters afield. Your elk get hit pretty hard when they're 2, 3, 4 years old, and they meet that 3-point, 4-point, 5-point. They get hit pretty hard because they're the only ones that can get taken. And what you end up with is you're providing more hunting opportunity. You're still meeting your bull ratio, but you're primarily meeting it with younger bulls. And so what we find from a biological perspective is managing that harvest through hunter numbers, length of season days, trying to maintain a distribution of age classes of your bucks and bulls. That's going to be better for your population than what would happen under a buck-bull ratio management objective, where that antler point restriction just means putting more hunters afield and really hammering those older age animals.
Yeah. Well, some of the things I read in those studies is there are also some really young bucks that express as a 4-point as a youngster. And do they have the genetic predisposition to be that buck everyone is hoping will live to be 6 years old? Well, because now he's got the bummer of a birthright of being a 4-point at a young age, he gets tipped over.
Is the most thrifty. Maybe genetically your strongest animal has an extra year of harvest pressure on him. And so for a long time, and I was nervous when we went away from it, we had a forked antler or better bag limit for black-tailed deer. And I shot a yearling 3-point buck one year. Yes, probably 85-90% of our black-tailed deer bucks are a spike their first year. But those ones that are the most thrifty, the most healthy, have the best antler growth, have the best genetics, they're open to harvest. And so then you're skewing your reproduction in the future to those that didn't have that. And it's hard. We still hear a lot of that. I think you probably had some questions about are you gonna go back to fork or better for black-tailed deer? And we're really watching those populations and the buck ratios. And if we had to, I guess we'd have to look at whether or not we'd want to go that way to increase buck ratios, or whether you're manage hunter days for a season that I think is 35 days long right now for a general season. If we're not meeting buck ratio, maybe that's a better solution and healthier for the population.
Yeah. Well, Brian, we got more of these if we wanted to go through them, but we're already an hour and 30 minutes into this gig.
That went fast.
Look at the audience is like, can you guys just wrap it up, man? You're putting me to sleep here. But I enjoy when I can have people like you with the science background, and you at your position in the agency, you also are a bit of that front face of you're trying to synthesize the science with the human social element, right? Everybody wants to have more hunting opportunity and wants to have higher success rates, but within the confines of the biology, the ecology, and the science of these animals, everyone doesn't get what they want. So you get to be the person who has to try guide where that goes. And I really appreciate it when you share and some of your peers and other agencies share such great information to give hunters who are listening to this podcast an understanding of how complicated it really is. We're not going to solve this with just one simple, easy little thing. If that was the case, we would have solved it a long time ago, and a lot of you guys could have went home. But it's and then
but can I also say It's complicated, but we have to stick with it. And
Right.
so we're not going to solve it by just throwing our hands in the air.
Nope.
And so people need to be involved. They need to be weighing in. They need to make sure that their concern is heard, because that's what makes a difference when it comes to governing bodies, is knowing that people are passionate and care, and this is important to them.
Yeah. Well, I have had my best day. I'm to the state of Oregon, where a lot of people think the state of Oregon, your reputation out there in the national level is like, that's kind of an interesting place. But there are more fanatic hunters and anglers in Oregon per capita than a lot of other states. And you guys have a diversity here that is, I don't know that there's any state that has the diversity from the coast to the coastal range to the Cascades to all the valleys, has the Columbia River that has every species, both native and non-native. We talked a lot about the Southeast Great Basin desert country. And I'm looking at my fingers here. I got a bunch of pink dye under my fingernails because I got to catch my first steelhead on Wednesday, 2 days ago. And I also was here in October, and my best day of waterfowl hunting in the last 5 years was here in Oregon. And no one would think about that as Oregon, a waterfowl state? Well, you guys got amazing waterfowl hunting. So the diversity of what you guys have and just tipped my water over, and the quality of opportunities that are there. All your Oregon people are like, shut up, Randy. Don't tell the whole world about that. We don't want everyone coming over here. We don't want them coming catching our steelhead. And in my case, I'm dreaming about these invasive toothy walleyes up there in the upper pools of the Columbia. So if you guys ever need some help removing those, have boat, we'll travel. I two of my dreams or checklist items are Columbia blacktail and Roosevelt elk. I don't know if I'll ever get those checked off my list, but I start rambling off all this stuff, and that's in your state.
It's incredible, and I'm trying to remember. I don't even think I've caught a steelhead yet, and that's the unique thing about Oregon, right? Is you can be passionate about hunting or fishing, and you talk to someone else that's passionate about hunting or fishing, and you don't even pursue the same things at all because there's just not enough time in the year. And so, I don't know, I probably put myself probably a dozen, 15 salmon in the freezer last year, caught a couple of halibut, shot my black-tailed deer buck, got a couple forest grouse. I was unsuccessful for elk, and then Columbia, like, I don't have time for that. Walleye, I don't have time for that. It's crazy just how diverse it is, and you can chase stuff every weekend, and I do chase stuff almost every weekend.
Yeah.
And then I talk to people that are chasing entirely different stuff.
Yeah.
I wouldn't live anywhere else. It's got its challenges. Mm-hmm. Every state does. Yeah. But I guess I'm kind of passionate about doing what I can to try to help the wildlife side of the state to be there now and in the future. And yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of your listeners that say, well, you're not doing a very good job of that. And I get it. But there's a lot to try to do. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's a great state.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate last year, Director Colbert being on here, and I appreciate her yesterday telling me, let Brian say whatever he wants to say. I'm not putting any sideboards on that guy. Do you know how rare that is for a state agency employee who is accountable to budgets and legislatures and everything else to be given free rein? And I don't think I ran us in the ditch too far. But you brought up one thing when the mics are turned off, this grouse thing. You guys have rough grouse in this state?
Rough grouse, blue grouse. And so with our blue grouse, it's sooty blue grouse and dusky blue grouse. So we got both kinds of blue grouse.
But this rough grouse thing.
We have rough grouse.
Like in huntable numbers?
In huntable numbers.
Is that what you said when you shot forest grouse? Were they roughies or?
Yeah, I shot a roughie. Shot a couple roughies this year.
All right, we'll turn off the mics. I'm a good guy, and I share a lot of information, but I don't share anything about rough grouse hunting. So, I mean, I'm already going to be buying my non-resident hunting license to apply.
Yep.
It'd be crazy not to come back
It'd be crazy not to come back
and shoot some rough grouse.
Yep. Now, I don't know that you want to go with me. My Vizsla's now, I think, turning 11.
Oh,
Is that right? So my dog's a little slow, a little old, doesn't cover ground like he used to, but
it sounds like me. Old, slow, doesn't cover much ground. But anyhow, Brian, thanks so much. I'll be interested to check in to see how the mule deer plan is going in 4 or 5 years, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot along that path. But
yes.
you know, if you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got. So it's pretty brave of you guys to take on something as culturally significant to hunters in Oregon as mule deer, and say, you know what, we know nobody likes change, but we believe that this is going to be a better outcome. That's a pretty risky thing to do. A lot of people would be like, no, I'll just stay in my lane here.
I might have been the one saying I'm not sure that's pushing hard, and I tried to tamper because that's the way we've always done it, is the way we got to do it.
Yeah.
And so certainly have a lot of really smart folks in the agency, and a lot of encouragement all the way up to the director's office to say, we have to do something different. It's not acceptable where we're at for mule deer. And so if that means overturning the apple cart, go ahead, overturn the apple cart, because we're not going to just keep doing the same thing.
That's cool. Well, I look forward. Hopefully maybe we can go rough grouse hunting in 3 or 4 years, and we can talk about how it's progressing.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate it, folks. Appreciate you all sitting through this. Thanks so much. And for all of you who left comments out in the hinterlands of Facebook and Instagram, thanks to you also.